All right, today we're going to be talking about Chapter 21, which is going to detail two major topics. The first being the foreign policy of our three progressive presidents, Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. So I am actually, for the purposes of the recorded lecture, going to go ahead and skip over those topics because that's something that we covered in class for all of my classes, both A and B day. So I'm going to go ahead and just record for the recorded lecture. I'm just going to go ahead and move forward to where we got with the A group on Wednesday. Now, if you're in Mr. Blaze class listening to this, there might be a few discrepancies, but I'm going to go ahead and pick up where I left off with my A group on Wednesday of February 17th. So I'm going to go ahead and skip over Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, and we talked about the causes of the U.S. joining the war. We talked about the American Expeditionary Forces and the unfortunate racism that existed within the military, that 400,000 African Americans did serve in the military, but most of them in menial positions. Okay, so this is kind of where we left off on the lecture. We had briefly talked about the new weapons and technologies of World War I, which, led to really, really horrible number of casualties. If you can see there on the right, the British Empire, France, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Russia all lost over 1 million soldiers. And then you add in the Italian and United States casualties, which, were upwards of 500,000 in Italy and 100,000 for the United States, even though the United States had only been part of the war for 1 year. The new technologies are part of the militarization that we talked about for the causes of World War I. And the nature of the new technology is going to lead to the creation of trench warfare, which was what also led to the stalemate and just the mass casualties on all sides. So you can see up in the top there is a machine gun and just the pure rounds of ammunition, and then at the bottom there is a tank. Okay, so kind of shifting gears from the war in Europe to looking at the home front and how World War I impacted the United States at home. One of the most important things we have to realize is that this was a complete and total war. So all of our businesses and government, our social, political, and economic aspects of American life were government regulated. And typically in the United States, especially after the Industrial Revolution, people kind of feared government regulation and preferred that the government were more laissez-faire and more hands-off. So this is going to be a huge shift, but obviously, there are wartime feelings towards allowing the government to be more hands-on. So for financing the war, the U.S. Spent $32 billion by the war's end. So that exceeded the GNP, gross national product, combined since 1910. So basically in that 4 years that were involved, 4.5 years that were involved in World War I, whether it be trade or actual combat, we were able to accrue $32 billion in spending, which at that time was a lot. One of the main ways that we funded the war were through Liberty bonds, which was basically the United States population is buying bonds from the United States government. And what they would do is later on, the government would pay back those bonds, and it would all be with interest. So that was the incentive there. There was also increased income taxes and inheritance taxes of up to 70% of your paycheck. So, the expectation, though, was that you were loyal to the victory and that there was not, you weren't going to complain as much as you would prior. Some other steps that Wilson took to prepare for the war economy: he created a Council of National Defense at the federal level and in each state, that they kind of worked together to create government regulation of railroads, food, fuel, and other resources that would need to be allocated to the war effort. We then have a super important term, the War Industries Board. The War Industries Board is a government organization that coordinated the purchase of war supplies. So basically, it was the attempt at government regulation of mass producing war technologies, and this was headed up by a guy named Bernard Baruch, and he was basically in charge of just making sure that war production was at its peak. Now, obviously, we are going to learn some new lessons from having a managed economy and the government being more hands-on. And, some people are going to like it, some people are going to hate it, some people are going to be indifferent, but we're at least experiencing it, and this is all kind of happening throughout the progressive era as well. So you have to keep that in mind as, being an important piece to this whole equation. The National War Labor Board, this is going to address labor disputes throughout the war. The expectation is that, naturally, labor disputes are going to decrease during the war. It would be unpatriotic for people to go on strike during a world war. So the National War Labor Board basically made major changes to labor that had been, worked towards throughout the progressive era and the Industrial Revolution, to basically make concessions with these people to ensure that they weren't going on strike throughout the war effort. So things like the 8-hour workday, equal pay for equal work, and the right to collectively bargain. So this was actually progress for labor unions during the war. We also then see, though, some violence still breaks out throughout this time period. So we have the Ludlow Massacre, which took place with the Western Federation of Miners, and they were upset about their working conditions, and obviously the demand for mining was very high with the need for coal to power machines and things like that. So men, women, and children all continued to strike after being evicted from their housing provided by their company. And both militia and strikebreakers attacked, and a battle broke out, killing 39 people, including 11 children and 4 women. So as much progress as unions made, there was also severe incidents that occurred. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to be looking at is the economic and social results of the war, the outcome of the war on different social groups, different minority groups, on the economy, etc. So a key concept here of 7.2 I, B, and C. All right, so there was huge economic growth during the war, as there usually is. From 1914 to 1917, we're aiding the British and the Allies by sending supplies and aid, which is going to allow us to see an economic boom. Now, During the war, when white men were away fighting, this led to a lot of new job opportunities for minority workers, whether it be Asian, African American, Mexican American, or women. A lot of jobs are going to open up, and this is going to be a huge benefit to, showing, these people who had been marginalized that they were very capable of being successful and impactful in the economy. Now, we do see a huge increase in inflation during the war, which caused this kind of fake temporary wage increase that was unfortunately going to go back down when the war ends. And inflation, we'll come back to that with the problems of inflation during wartime. But basically, the artificially high prices seem like great at the time, but eventually will be problematic. We're going to see the shipbuilding industry and farming output increase dramatically, which is going to, help the farmers as well as people out west in the shipbuilding industry. But one of the huge impacts of World War I is the Great Migration, and it's really, really important that you are paying attention to the fact that during this time, hundreds of thousands of African Americans move from the South to the North. A couple of push factors or reasons that they leave. They're obviously trying to escape racism, poverty, debts, and violence towards their people. But there was this new sense of freedom and autonomy in northern African American communities, as well as factory jobs that were opened up by the war. Many different advertisements were used to recruit African Americans to move north. And interestingly enough, when groups of African Americans moved to northern cities, it wasn't a lot of conflict between the blacks and whites that were living in these cities, but it was actually the African Americans that already lived there that were feuding or butting heads with the new African Americans who were moving into these neighborhoods. So, it was a little taste of kind of that idea of nativism, but in a different sense of, new people and old people. Throughout the war, race riots did break out, especially in St. Louis and in Philadelphia. And there was a lot of conflict. There's actually a lot of, comparison between the COVID-19 pandemic and the influenza pandemic, that there, during both of these time periods, there was an outbreak of civil rights movements, of a fight for equality. And we will see, in St. Louis, a white mob literally burnt down a black neighborhood and were shooting at the fleeing people. So the violence was almost next level when we think about what was happening throughout this time period. In this picture here, in this kind of montage, you can see shipbuilding, you can see women at work, you can see Chinese workers in the top right, you can see the migration of an African-American family there in the middle, and then you can see a white and a black man working together here on, I don't know what, the creation of something, and then some advertisements for migration, as well as a news article talking about the massacre in St. Louis. The women's impact on the war was going to be huge. The war was going to help greatly in leading to the 19th Amendment and suffrage for women. So women were really fighting for pacifism. Women in this case fought for, they created even their own women's peace party. So pacifism is the idea of not joining the war. Why use violence when you can work things out with compromise and things like that? So Carrie Chapman Catt, who was one of our main leading supporters of the women's rights movement, is going to create the Women's Peace Party and lead it. National Association for the Women are going to, NASA openly supported the war effort and a sense of patriotism. There were groups of women that were mothers that simply believed the war was immoral because their sons were being sent over. And other ways that people showed support throughout the war: women joined their local Red Cross to try to donate, their services. Kids raised money for war bonds. Churches prayed for the soldiers. But for the most part, Some other people who were against the war, socialists, believed that the war was being fought by capitalist nations fighting for economic supremacy, which was something that they pushed for throughout this time period. Okay, so this is a super important slide. Make sure that you're paying attention because this is a huge key concept slide, and it really it talks about the impacts of the war at home and as far as espionage and sedition. So the CPI, or Committee on Public Information, was created during the war to create or to produce and publish a lot of propaganda. So this is a lot of pro-war literature that was created by the Committee on Public Information, and it pushed to increase positive war propaganda around the country to get people to join the military and be less weary of the draft. Many believe the only way we could win the war was if there was an overwhelming attitude of support from home. Now, what was also passed during the war was what's called the Espionage and Sedition Acts, which gives the government way more power during wartime. So what the Espionage Act did is it allowed for harsh punishments of those who were accused of spying, sabotage, or obstruction of the war effort. So basically, anyone who spoke out against the war. And then the Sedition Acts made it illegal to publicly oppose the war. So basically, it allowed the government to regulate any dissenters and anybody who might have talked badly about the war effort. And, this was huge. This was a huge expansion of federal government power and, does make people question the role of government in their everyday lives. Now, on the other hand, the American Protective League formed with 250,000 Americans who felt the need to monitor their disloyal members of their community. So, does this breach the right to privacy and the right to speak freely, if you can't dissent against the war? And the Supreme Court would argue that during wartime, your civil liberties are limited. We also are going to see bouts of racism in the sense of 100% Americanism throughout the war. A lot of immigrants, especially German immigrants, were, very much persecuted during the war, as well as Irish immigrants who, their anti-British attitudes were going to have a huge impact. Okay, so again, shifting gears, the post-war world is a very complicated topic. And in this case, Woodrow Wilson has a very specific and well-planned out idea for how the post-war world should look. And Wilson writes these in what are called the 14 points. So Wilson makes these recommendations. He's going to bring them to the Paris Peace Conference. And the 14 points, you can see them listed below. But they're going to be focusing on adjusting post-war boundaries, breaking up Austria-Hungary, the empire, as well as the Ottoman Empire, breaking up and punishing Germany. We're going to see the creation of new nations and the suggestion of demilitarization, reducing the size of militaries throughout the world, reducing the amount of imperialism, opening up the freedom of the seas, opening up freedom of trade, and all other sort of, the idea of self-determination and being able to freely vote for who and where you want to live. And then lastly, the 14th point is the creation of the League of Nations, which would be an international peacekeeping organization that would, monitor and try to keep it that World War I would truly be the war to end all wars. So this was obviously Wilson's idealistic vision for the world. I think it's important to know that this was just, all kind of in theory. Now, some of the problems of the 14 points is there weren't a lot of execution strategies. So there was no set strategy to create universal self-determination. How are we going to allow people to have complete say in who and where they are living? It didn't address any existing economic tensions when it comes to free trade. And, not everybody agreed that a democratic nation was best for the world. And we remember moral diplomacy, more democracy. I can't multitask there. Moral diplomacy is this idea that everybody should be democratic. Lenin challenged Wilson in obviously the ideas of communism versus capitalism or democratic governments. And Lenin and Wilson would ultimately be competing for the post-war support. Wilson gave his 14-point speech early to gain international support, but unfortunately it doesn't really transpire. Some early obstacles that Wilson's going to face. He felt a lot of pushback when his allies basically felt that he had separated himself by keeping American troops out of the war, and he was just an associate ally. He didn't really gain a lot of trust from the British and the French and the other allied countries. Somewhat, and then obviously there was disagreements on how to deal with Germany. Some wanted to execute Kaiser Wilhelm II. Others wanted complete compensation for the destruction caused. But really what was agreed upon by Britain and France is that there was going to be extremely harsh punishments, where Wilson didn't exactly agree with that. He wasn't completely on board with the harsh punishments. So we're going to see the Paris Peace Conference, or the PPC. This is a meeting at the end of the war. The war ends on November 11th, on the 11th day of the 11th month in the 11th hour in 1918. And the Paris Peace Conference will bring together what are called the Big Four. And we have France, England, Italy, and the United States. Ultimately, Italy and Japan are going to be kind of left in the dust when it comes to the writing of the Treaty of Versailles. And Woodrow Wilson is kind of in his own little world of trying to, get the American people and the American government on board with joining the League of Nations, which we know in hindsight that the United States does not ultimately join. So during, the conference, most of the 14 points were disputed, talked about, and rejected. And, this was, a huge defeat for Wilson at the Paris Peace Conference. So the reparations that were suggested and actually implemented, Wilson was against reparations. He believed that the reparations were going to create economic issues. Because obviously they do. Germany ultimately paid $9 billion in reparations. This was what kept them from ever becoming powerful enough to take over Europe again. LOL, Hitler, right? Because we know, obviously, they're going to seek great revenge for the Treaty of Versailles. Wilson was successful in dividing up Germany's imperial lands within the League of Nations. France wanted to break up East Germany, into 4 different states, kind of like post-World War II, but that was rejected. And Germany's imperial lands would be divided up among the League of Nations, which was going to be problematic in the future because countries like Italy and Japan truly felt like they were left out of that breaking up of land. All right, so the League of Nations is a permanent international peacekeeping organization in charge of overseeing world affairs and preventing another world war from happening. The League of Nations is great in theory, but the problem is that they did not really have a plan for executing the rules, basically. And the plan was that it would fix all the problems left from the Paris Peace Conference. Now, there were no rules, no consequences if you broke a rule. So there were rules. There was no consequences if you broke them. So, to kind of summarize this slide here is that Wilson really, really struggled at home with getting the United States to become part of the League of Nations. He desperately wanted to be a member in the League, but many Americans wanted to basically retreat right back into isolationism. And Wilson is going to truly, this is going to be what he meets his demise with. His health was deteriorating as he was touring the country trying to convince members of Congress to vote for the League of Nations. This is, going to be a grueling number of hours. Ultimately, Wilson basically did not... Oh, I'm sorry. We have Henry Cabot Lodge, who was kind of the opposition of Wilson. He was 100% against the treaty and tried to poke holes in Wilson's proposals, but ultimately they could not decide, and the influence of Lodge decreased the overall support of the League. So, Wilson, sadly, is going to have a stroke during this time. He went on a cross-country speaking tour, which led him to, having this stroke, trying to convince people to support the joining of the League of Nations. He rallied for the Democrats in Senate as the Republicans were about to take basically an overhaul of the Congress. But on November 19th, 1919, almost a year after the war ended, the treaty was rejected in the Senate, and the U.S. does not join the League of Nations. As far as labor goes, post-war America was supposed to be progressive and reformed, but it really became very conservative and very repressive. The 1920s were a time of kind of taking a step backwards, and we had to quickly reverse into a peacetime economy, which was going to end all of the National War Labor Board, progress, and businesses, unfortunately, were going to suffer because of the boom and bust of the wartime economy. Businesses are going to go bankrupt. Farmers had to foreclose on their farms because they had, taken out all of these loans to provide food for everybody around. And, ultimately that was going to just end up in a bunch of debt when the war ends. There were wartime wage increases that were going to almost immediately be decreased, and job security became very scarce as the veterans returned home. The people who had filled up their jobs were now kind of left in the dust. There was a lot of turmoil after the war in the way of labor unions. Labor leaders basically lost all the headway they had gained during the war. And there was a huge increase in the number of strikes. In 1919, we see the Boston police strike, which is a problem because the police are supposed to be protecting people. The National Guard had to be called in by Calvin Coolidge, the new president. Sorry, not the president. I'm not sure what he was at the time. But anyways, I digress. And then the steel workers were defeated in a strike in 1919 as well. In Gary, Indiana, 18 strikers were killed. And the AFL basically took one of their final hits here in this steel workers strike. As I talked about before, the war had a huge impact on African Americans. When African Americans returned home, they expected equal treatment from whites, as they had served in the war the same as any white man had. They fought, African Americans both fought in the war and took over the white jobs when they were at war, really, truly proving themselves in society. So the expectation of equality was extremely high. Unfortunately, that was the opposite of what happened. Chicago race riots are going to break out in 1919, starting with a black child who was killed while swimming. A rock was thrown at him and he drowned. This was considered Red Summer, as across the country, 120 plus lives were lost. And something new about these riots were that there were, whites fighting blacks, but there was also blacks fighting blacks because of that great migration that took place throughout the war. We're also going to see the rise of somebody named a black nationalist named Marcus Garvey. And what he did is he created this return to Africa or back to Africa movement. He basically said there was no way that African Americans would ever be equal in the United States. So let's move back to Africa. And this all lasted really, until Marcus Garvey was deported to his home country of Jamaica, which is kind of ironic that he wanted to do a back to Africa movement, but was from Jamaica. Here you can see the migrations of African Americans throughout, 1910 to 1950, and there's a huge sprawl in these maps. And then the last thing that we need to talk about is the Red Scare. So the Red Scare was this is the first Red Scare. The second one will obviously be at the start of the Cold War, but it's a fear of communism, the fear of radical communism spreading throughout the United States. This was a huge push by the middle class to get rid of U.S. radicals, and that 100% Americanism idea is going to show up again. They basically were, pushing the idea that communism needed to be feared. The Palmer raids were led by A. Mitchell Palmer, the FBI director, and this led to the arrest of 6,000 people, potentially being communists. Keyword being potential. That's kind of a problem. A really important event that we must look at is Sacco and Vanzetti. These are two Italian immigrants that were found guilty on murder charges that there was no evidence to support that they had murdered anybody. They were, unfortunately, because they were immigrants and anarchists, many people feared them and feared them to be radical. Now, once they were executed and sentenced to death and executed, people began to really study what happened to them. And there was widespread support for Sacco and Vanzetti, and people really were looking at the unfairness of the situation. So through this, one of the most important organizations in American history was created, the American Civil Liberties Union, which still exists today and constantly is using the courts and their voices to be heard. The ACLU was created, but what we see is the rise of what they call the return to normalcy, which was the platform that Warren G. Harding ran on in 1920. So he wins the election and is going to begin a 10-year Republican administration. And that's it for today. Thank you for listening.